And welcome back to the Wellness Paradox podcast. I'm so grateful that you can join us on this journey towards greater human flourishing. As always, I'm your host, Michael Stack, an exercise physiologist by training and a health entrepreneur and a health educator by trade. And I'm fascinated by a phenomena I call the wellness paradox. This paradox, as I view it, is the trust, interaction, and communication gap between fitness professionals and our medical community. This podcast is all about closing off that gap by disseminating the latest, most evidence-based, and most engaging information in the health sciences. And to do that in episode 60, we're joined by Renee Rogers. Renee is a dancer turned medical fitness professional, eventually turned researcher and consultant in the space of behavior change and health behavior change, spending the early part of her career working on a multidisciplinary team with a physician and a behavior change specialist. And this conversation is around just that, how we facilitate long-term behavior change in our clients. Quite possibly, this is one of the more important types of discussions we can have, because as we'll talk about during the conversation, you could write the best exercise program in the world, adhere to the guidelines as strictly as possible. But if your client doesn't implement them and adhere to them over the long term, it's going to have a very minimal impact in the grand scheme of things on their health. And this conversation will look under the hood of how we facilitate behavior change from a long-term basis with a client. Renee is going to pull from the research, but what I also love is she makes it very translational and practical, ultimately distilling it down into stories and anecdotes and actionable things you can walk away from this conversation with. Any information we'd like to share with you from today's episode can be found on the show notes page by going to wellnessparadoxpod.com/episode 60. Please enjoy this conversation with Renee Rogers. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Renee Rogers. Renee, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, you're very welcome. And this is going to be a fun conversation around an interesting topic around coaching health behavior change, around motivation, and how we effectively do that as a fitness professional. And the coaching psychology topics are always the ones that I find so fascinating, because I tell my students all the time that you could write the best exercise program in the world, but if someone isn't going to do it, it doesn't do anyone any good. So that's what this conversation is going to be around. But before we dive into that, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background to provide some context?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's great. So I'm an interesting case, I think, in terms of just my career path and how I've gotten to where I'm at. And I actually started out as a professional dancer. I was working, obviously it's career number one, and then this kind of led me to career number two. But now, uniquely, I try to use what I learned there for here. I think a lot of people can tell that story, but my path was not linear. It was not undergrad, grad school, like a lot of other people have. I mean, I was dancing professionally. And when the time came to step back and say, okay, your body isn't loving this anymore. This auditioning world is kind of rough and tough. And I had actually had some friends that were experiencing some issues with their bodies breaking down, disordered eating, things along those lines, because it can be intense in the professional space. Not to say that everything's negative, but it can be intense to maintain appearances and body and all those different things. And for me, I personally struggled with my body weight and keeping my body in the shape and the expectation. So when I went to step back, it was really hard as this girl whose dream was to dance professionally and do that, and now say, okay, now what? Yeah. And went to school, undergrad, Youngstown State University, and had no idea what I was going to do, and literally stumbled through the recreation center and saw the Department of Exercise Science. I'm like, what is that? That is cool. Like, what is exercise science? And, just started taking classes and declared my major. And I'll tell you, the first time I opened up my ACSM guidelines book and started reading it, it was over. I was in love because I was finally understanding the body and what we could do with it. and how exercise is medicine and how all those amazing things that I didn't quite understand before, or was really getting terrible misinformation around, how I could actually affect and help people. And that's when I fell in love. From there, though, I ended up going to physical therapy school. And it's funny, I went all the way through, went all the way to the very end towards my last clinical and went, I don't like this. Something's missing. And, my parents will still razz me to this day about it. But I missed the exercise prescription side. When I got to PT, you really start to get into reimbursement space. We know how rigid that can all be. But I missed that ability to really get to know a person and prescribe exercise for them, and really that uniqueness about it and that creativity that goes along with it. And that's where I think my creative background kind of really worked well with how I prescribed exercise, because I found a balance and a love for, well, these are what the guidelines tell me to do, but this is how I can mold and fix and tweak and make it about the person that I'm working with. So when I got to PT land, I felt like that was a little bit harder to do, right, from a reimbursement standpoint. So Renee left that space and decided to go out and just practice and just be a practitioner. And I really started in more of a medical fitness space. I was working for a company that brought together an exercise physiologist, a behavioral psychologist, and a nutrition dietitian expert. And we were working with medical referrals in our area and our physicians, and they were referring us patients to help with weight loss and other health-related behaviors. So early on, I got to be in the medical fitness space, which was great because I learned really quickly how to interact and just have really good conversations with practitioners. So I think a little bit of my PT background helped with that. But Renee got bored. No, I didn't get bored. I just realized very quickly that as much as I had learned in the great background that I got from my bachelor's degree, I needed to go a little deeper. So I went back to the University of Pittsburgh for my master's and my PhD, and specifically went to study at the University of Pittsburgh at the time. John Jakisik was there, and I was really interested in obesity, weight loss, but really the behavioral side and the technology-based side. If you don't know Dr. Jakisik, he is one of the absolute best at getting folks to engage in physical activity while they're trying to lose weight. And it's not all dietary based. He's very good if you haven't read his stuff. So I really wanted to work with him, and that launched my career at Pitt. And from there, I was lucky enough to stay on as a faculty member for about 8 years. And at the same time, my practitioner hat came back on, and I was the director of faculty and staff wellness programming at the university. So that's where I was tying together work in research interventions on physical activity and weight loss and wide-scale programming at the university. And just recently, this last year, I've taken a step away from academia, and I'm working as a research and practitioner and consulting in the fitness space. So lots of career changes in my life, but I think it's given me interesting perspective and trying to roll all these different elements together. And I think the creative in me always wants to keep trying and changing and morphing forward. But I also think that that's a little bit of what we need to do in this space to keep it fresh.
Without a doubt. And I love the path. Something that you said there I really enjoyed, and it's probably part of this discussion, although I don't know how deep we'll go on it, is you talked about, the guidelines, how to apply the guidelines. And this is something that I think new practitioners will struggle with quite a bit, is that, they look at them as more rules than than guidelines. And those are two different things. And I think you, with your dancing background and your creativity, I think that's an interesting, commentary that you made right there, is you realize that, hey, these aren't rigid rules you have to apply. These are guidelines that are going to be different based on every person that you're going to interact with.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's such a critical thing, because we can take 150 minutes, for example. We know, right? We see it time and time again. Newest physical activity guidelines have come out. Once again, they've showed this sweet spot, right? But the reality is that is a pathway. And I think sometimes if we think of the guidelines as a pathway to get us there, it's really helpful, because the minute we start talking numbers to our clients and saying, we need to get you to 150 minutes per week. Now, the right person that's the right conversation, because they love seeing the endpoint that they're working to. But for some reason, they're like, you want me to do what and how much right now? And they've shut you off. The conversation's ended, right? So it's really understanding that those guidelines are for us as practitioners to make sure that we are going by the research-based principles, and it's our pathway with our clients. Or maybe I should say that's our guideline. And then from there, we create the pathway with our clients to get them to achieve those, those special circumstances.
Yeah. And that's kind of where we're going with this conversation here, more the behavioral psychology, the behavior change element. So let's start zooming in here a little bit more from this really broad background that you have. We're going to talk about motivation, and motivation is such an interesting topic. And I feel like you hear so many different opinions on motivation. And obviously this is something you've studied. So let's start with just the basics. Let's level set us. How would you describe motivation from a view that a fitness professional should look at it?
Yeah. So, wow, first and foremost, I'm going to say, like, almost put theory aside for a second. Because I think as fitness professionals, and I'll be completely honest with you, I don't know that we've done a good job educating our fitness professionals on how to make theory, the behavior theory, all of it consumable, not only for the fitness professional, but also for our client. So sometimes we have to take a little step away from theory and revert ourselves back to thinking about the person that we're working with. Step one's the person, because at the end of the day, if you can have a nice conversation, two-way street, right? Conversation, they're going to tell you everything that you need to know.
Yep.
And then from there, you can take a step back and say, okay, based on what I learned, this is the strategy that I'm going to try to move forward and apply from there. And that's, again, like, you go back to your guidelines, you go back to your toolkit and say, this will work, and that'll work. I think very often as fitness professionals, we're trying to take something and lay it on top, rather than take the person and have them just answer all the questions for us. They're going to tell us where we need to go and what direction we need to take. And I truly, my biggest position with all of this is trying to find what I like to call the relevant, plug, or the relevant link with your folks. And I think relevance comes before motivation. Oh. And I'm asked to speak on this topic a lot, but thinking about that for a second, right? How can someone be motivated to do something if it's not actually important to them?
Yeah. And
I think that's something that, we often, as fitness professionals, we create a brand, right? And this is my brand, and this is what I'm about. And I tend to go in this direction with things. And that's great. And for certain businesses in certain places that can really work, you're likely going to get a certain kind of client that follows that as well, right? But for others that are doing more global work, right, that are trying to work with all different clients, maybe even people that aren't, right, connected to fitness or connected to physical activity, that's when I really feel like we have to pull away from our brand and really become about the person and listen to what the person has to say and try to find their relevant link.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. So much there to unpack, which is great, because this is a complicated area. I mean, let's be honest, when you talk about the populations that fitness professionals work with, we talk about these statistics all the time. We're really working with 20% of the population, and the other 80%, they're not engaging. So clearly we have to think about this a little bit more broadly.
Exactly.
You said something to start, which I think is important to touch on. Is you said it starts with a conversation. It starts with, relevance. And one thing I find that new fitness professionals, younger fitness professionals, are always challenged by is developing that rapport initially, because in many cases it's a early 20-something, exercise fanatic that's talking to the mid 50s, anything but an exercise fanatic. And it's almost like two ships, crossing in the night. How do you advise, young professionals to try to make that connection when somebody's so different?
Yeah. It's funny, and I'll anchor this. Let me tell you a quick story about when I was a young professional, and I had a really interesting experience. I was working with a woman. This was actually when I was just at a fitness center working, and she was motivated. So very extrinsically motivated because her daughter was getting married. Mm-hmm. And so she wanted to get the job done in 6 months. Right. Mm-hmm. So me making a connection with her wasn't actually that important. because she had enough extrinsic motivation that she had a dress to fit in. She wanted to look good. And it was really important that to her daughter that she go to this beach wedding somewhere, right?
Right.
So she pounded through. I gave her a great program. She lost weight. She was waking up 5 a.m. every morning to come to the gym to work with me. She was doing this really hard, intense program. And once the wedding we asked to interview her for our newsletter. And my colleague said to her, you are doing so great. Now that you're an exercise person, exact language, how do you feel? You're so successful. And she looked back and her quote was, or I think we asked her to give a quote. Her quote was, when I think about becoming an exercise person, and she did the little exercise person in quotes, she said, it feels as far away or not realistic, unrealistic, right, as going to a remote travel channel destination. And we were like, that is what? But what are you talking about? You're doing it. You've become. And she said, that's not who I am. And so that in that moment in time, like this young, motivated Renee was like, what did I do? Because from an outcomes perspective, she was great. It was everything that on paper would be really good. But from a human perspective, I had missed the mark totally because I didn't have a conversation with her ahead of time. And then when I finally stepped back and said, well, tell me why you don't feel this way. She goes, I don't like this. I don't like waking up early. I don't like the types of exercises that I'm doing. I'm tired. I'm not getting enough sleep. Okay, so let's stop and talk. What will work for you? And then we had a real conversation. And she started to tell me that what's really important to her now is her daughter's pregnant and she wants to be able to lift her kids up and she has back pain. Yeah. And she wants to sleep more because of her job is really stressful and she feels like she's not performing as well at her job anymore. We really started to go through and have these really rich conversations about what could work for you. And all of a sudden, she answered it for me. So I think as a young fitness professional, before we start anything, like while she was motivated, I just jumped right into a program, but I never asked what could work for her. Because the reality is she was never going to sustain what we were doing before because her extrinsic motivation of the wedding was gone. So even if we know there's a goal in mind, that question of, what do you think can work for you? And a lot of people are going to say, I'm not sure. That's okay. Then you can start to go from there. But you'd be surprised how that simple question can really help that person also trust you and say, okay, they're not going to push something on me. They really care about me. You're putting them in the center.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating story because up until that moment when she gave that quote, you probably felt like you did the best job you possibly could have done.
100%. And I genuinely, I've never had the nerve to ask her, but I'm fairly certain I know that she was not going to come back. Yeah. Like it really and truly, like I can just guess because the holidays were coming and knowing this person, and I didn't realize quite what she had done at the time. She had a very, very stressful high level position, and knowing what was coming down the pike in her life, there was a great chance that I was going to lose her altogether and probably lose contact with her and never have the opportunity to have that conversation. So even when we think we know, or we know there's at least some extrinsic motivation or goal in place, we can't be ignorant to the fact of allowing someone to tell us what is and isn't going to work for them. And even if it's outside of the guidelines, we have to check ourselves and say, it's a path. Yeah. No, they're not going to get 150 minutes in a week. No, they're not going to get 2 to 3 sessions of strength training right now. But here's what they can do. And if I can give them a taste or a dose, or at least get them moving more every day, that gives me the first level so that then we can keep trekking upwards, and small steps make for a climbing path. And we have to keep reminding ourselves of that.
Yeah. If I could distill all of that you send out into one word to make that appropriate connection, sounds like that word is curiosity. Just maintaining that open mindset of curiosity with the client. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I mean, it also, I agree. And I also say this all the time is we have to be careful that we're never ignorant to assume, right? Mm-hmm. That just because someone's been successful or someone is doing well and showing up, we don't always know what's going on deep down, and they don't always share everything with us. So knowing the line of taking what they do give us, respecting it, and, using that information, because I really think there's that fine line of, we talk a lot, especially with our technologies and different things out there now, like continuous prompting and following up with people. But we all know, right? When you get too much of something, we can easily say, okay, back off. And we almost, our clients do this as well. We get into avoidance behavior, right? Because we maybe aren't doing what we're hoping as clients, or, they're worried about disappointing us because we're not getting it. So the curiosity that you're mentioning is really important, because you're just checking in, right? You're making sure people are okay, rather than, are you doing what I'm asking you to do? Those are two very, very different things. That curiosity of building trust and rapport, and asking them to just say, are you okay? And how are things going? And is this working for you? Stepping back and not assuming that your perfect program is working for them, I think can go a really long way, so that they always respond to you, not just when they're doing well.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm sitting over here thinking of all the same stories that you probably think of in your career, where early on you thought you were doing the best thing, and you were actually pushing people away more than bringing them in. And it's fascinating. And hopefully it's conversations like this that young professionals can listen to, and maybe not make all the same mistakes we did when we were early in our career.
Yeah. It's funny, because even sometimes the conversation with somebody, or the question with somebody saying, like, how do you like to be communicated with? Mm-hmm. How often? And if they say they only want to talk to you a couple of times a week, that's okay. That's fine. You need to respect that, and find those lines, and you'll be surprised if you can build that little inch of trust and rapport. Wow, that goes a long way.
I'd like to take a quick break from today's episode to tell you a little something about one of our sponsors. As all of you are well aware, addressing the wellness paradox is a lifelong passion project for me. And when you're going to go on a long journey, it's difficult to go it alone. You need to find like-minded individuals that are willing to go on that crusade with you. And that's exactly what I found at the MRF Institute. The team over at the MRF Institute creates educational content for fitness and wellness professionals who are serious about becoming a part of our healthcare continuum. Getting on the healthcare continuum is all about leveling up our skills to be looked at as that valued resource provider. The wellness paradox is certainly an avenue for you to do that, but we need many different levers to pull if we're going to get there. And the MRF Institute is definitely one of those levers. You can go to their website, mrfinstitute.org, to find all kinds of great, informative, free informational content. And if you choose to engage with any of their paid content, they've created a coupon code specifically for Wellness Paradox listeners. You can enter in WP 2022, that's WP, and then the number 2022 to the website at checkout to receive a 15% discount on your purchase. I highly recommend you go check out mrfinstitute.org. Now back to today's episode. It doesn't. And that story that you told actually kind of leads nicely into our overarching topic today, which is long-term behavior change, because ultimately what you were able to do, maybe skillfully in that moment with that client, maybe you just stumbled on it, but one way or another is to shift from a short-term outcome to a long-term outcome. So from all of your vast academic experience and then just professional experience, like in the trenches, how do you go about facilitating long-term behavior change?
First and foremost,
for an easy question to ask you to give me a soundbite, I'm sure.
All right. No, when it comes to long-term behavior change, first and foremost, I'll say it's hard. Yeah. But anything that's hard requires us to continuously reevaluate and work at. And that goes with every client. So I think the idea of motivation revisited, something that I learned early in my career, and this came from a lot of the research studies, the long-term research interventions that I worked on. Every 3 to 6 months, we were having a conversation about motivation revisited, really getting back down to the why. Mm-hmm. Why are you here? Because if we think that the same reason or the same goals that we set when we first started with a client are going to be the same a month later, they're not. And it's really interesting when you look at research data, if we're just using data, we start to see that healthy lifestyle behaviors across the board and interventions drop off in 3 months. Even with hardcore research interventions where we can throw a lot of dollars and time into to keep people engaged. And we see the same thing with gyms and apps and technology. There's something about this 3-month space. So one of the things that I've really tried to focus in is going back to the why every so often, at least every 3 months, because that's using the data. But honestly, motivation can change, as we all know, hourly, daily, weekly, monthly. So it's really trying to check in at the right times, and knowing when the right times aren't easy, but making sure that it's something that regularly happens, I think is important. What the conversation you have is a little bit different, of course, with each person, but motivation revisited, it's got to keep changing, and it's going to keep changing.
Yeah, so unpack that a little bit more, just for people who are listening. What does that look like in practicality? And so, somebody comes in and everyone walks through the door and they want to lose weight or they want to look better. That's kind of the blessing or the curse that we face as fitness professionals, is that seems to be the number one goal. So that's what somebody comes through the door with. And so how do you start to uncover that why, and what's maybe does the trajectory of that why change based on your experience?
Yeah. I learned this in research interventions, and we always, one of the first things that we used to do with our participants, and I used to use the same strategy with clients, is we'd say, okay, tell me why you're here. And oh, by the way, you're not allowed to say, I want to lose weight. You're not allowed to make it about the outcome. Yep. And, think about that. So where do you want to be in 6 months? It's not about that. That's what you use to maybe set a goal, right? But when we're trying to get to underlying motivation, it's about, you want to lose weight. Why? You want to be more physically active. Why? Dive deeper. Tell me the why behind it. And then it gives you so much more information, because again, like think about my example I gave before. She came in because of the wedding. That was her why. Okay, but what is it about the wedding? I want to look good. I want to feel good. Okay, that gives me some information to start with, right? There's something to work on. Now, if I would have taken the time, right, a little bit sooner to talk to her, she might have started to say, I'm feeling good, I'm looking good, but I'm actually tired, or I might have learned something a little bit sooner along the way. So revisiting that deeper why, or how you're feeling along the way that motivates you. Because as we all know, right, we set long-term goals, but we know that the short-term goals are really the powerful asset that gets us to the long-term goal. At the same time, what are the daily ways, the small ways that you're feeling better, or small things that are changing, and asking questions about that? I think that really drives the larger motivation. Like, I'm sleeping better. I feel like I can get up the steps easier. If you can get folks to start talking about those small little changes that are happening in their physiology, while we see them as small, they're probably huge to that person. Jumping on those things, I really have found, as we have those interim conversations along the way.
Yeah, I find that so fascinating, because I just think of weight loss as a whole. And maybe go back to your client that lost all this great weight for the wedding. Maybe it was 20 pounds or 30 pounds. It takes a while to do that. Sure. And I mean, I've found this, and I'm sure you have as well during your career, that, 20 pounds is like way out there somewhere to lose all that weight. But, feeling better and sleeping better, all those kind of immediate, like physiological and psychological benefits of exercise, like those are here right now. And it ends up being a way to kind of shift the gratification in the process to something that's a little bit more instantaneous.
Yeah, exactly. And I really like to try to think about it is with the clients, and this may come down to how you prescribe, right? Is let's find the physical activity that serves you, not the physical activity that you think you should be doing for X outcome. Now, that's so like away from the guidelines, right? Because the guidelines are going to tell us, if we want to lose weight, we want to do upwards of 200 and 250 minutes of aerobic activity, all these things. However, if in the person's mind, that means I've got to go run, I've got to take a spinning class that doesn't work with my kid's schedule, or X, Y, Z, folks have preconceived notions about what it is, right? So if we can step back and say, let's really talk about, I need to get you to move. And I need to get you to move in a way that's a little bit more intense, but let's talk about what you need. What does your body need? What's going to make you feel good? What's going to help you right now? And if they say, I just need downtime, I need mind clearing time where I don't have to think. Okay, let's talk about that. Maybe a walk. Do you have time to go for a walk when you can be away from things and it can clear your mind and your stress? Now we found something relevant.
Yeah.
Right. Because that person just told us something. And as you just mentioned, we know that that's an immediate thing somebody can find by getting out and being active. All those wonderful immediate effects, if we can hone in on those and connect our prescription back to those, that person's going to feel something immediate rather than just, we always say, when you're done, you're so gratified. Wow, that's hard for people.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's really hard for people. They're like, sure, but
It says you.
Yeah, it says you, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think that's a really cool way to kind of spin the motivation and really use what's immediate to our advantage. And again, once they could create a consistent pattern of doing, then we can start to tweak that prescription and really start to get back into our guidelines and try to ramp them up in a way that's going to get them to where they need to go, that gets back to our guidelines, gets back to our framework.
Yeah. And I have to point out it for our audience, if they're not picking up on it, even some of the language you're using is so autonomy promoting for the client. It's, what would you think about doing something like that? Or could that work for you? Or why would that work for you? Mm-hmm. Which, I understand why we use the word prescription. I understand that it's prescriptive in nature, but I found that it sounds like, you found, particularly with the language you're using, that it's less of a prescription and more of a conversation of a prescription that somebody creates for themselves rather than you as the fitness professional just tossing over the fence.
Absolutely. Yeah. I previously described it as being like a frame you give someone. Mm-hmm. If I were to hand you a picture and it's in a frame and or a painting and I hand it to you and I say, okay, hang it on your wall, you might not like it.
Yeah.
Bottom line. Right. But if I just give you a frame and it's quite beautiful and I say to you, put whatever you want in it, there's a better chance, right? Yeah. That you are going to hang that up and you're going to use it. And you also have the ability to change it over time in a way that serves you. And I always like to go back to that because that frame that we give them can be leading them down the path that the guidelines show us.
Right.
But we're giving them that autonomy, like you said, that ability, that agency to make some decisions for themselves. And with our guidance, we're keeping them within a bracket. We know they're safe. We know they're not going somewhere they're not supposed to, but we're also not forcing them into something that they really don't like or love. And, it just popped into my head to think about this, but in marketing a lot, and I learned this early on, we talk about like a triangle of success, right? If you want to get somebody to purchase or consume a product, you usually think about a triangle, 3 sides of your triangle, something that they like or love, something that they value, and something that they're good at, or they know they're connected to. So if we think of a health behavior in the same way, or trying to get behavior change in the same way, we need to make sure that all 3 sides of that triangle connect. So how do we find something they like? How do we find something that they value? That's where that relevance comes in, right? If it's relevant to them, it's important to them right now to value. And, is it something that they feel like they're good at? Right. So if we're asking them to do something, or we're not priming them to do an activity that they're not good at, all those triangles, all the 3 sides of that triangle are not connected.
Yeah. And that's a great way to frame that up and, see things like self-determination theory and some of the other theories of health behavior change. If you're wondering what underlies everything, Renee said there, it's the middle of June at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We're not going to dive into self-determination theory right now, but there is a lot of theoretical underpinnings to that concept of, autonomy, connectedness, feeling competent. We all want to feel competent at the things we're doing. Yeah. I think this is such an interesting discussion because it really broadens what, a fitness professional thinks of, how they go about this process. There's physiology, but the physiology only matters to the extent that the psychology and the emotions are kind of going in a positive direction.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's the mind is going to be the thing that blocks you.
Yeah.
99% of the time. And for some, it's a lot easier. to drive, right? There's those folks that are very driven by habit, right? They can create a habit, and that habit it drives them to get up every day. We all know that person that can get up, go to the gym, nothing stops them. It's really, almost, I hate to say easy for them, but they are one that can find it and follow, and it works. For most people, though, it's a lot tougher. It's a lot tougher. And there's other things are going to take over. And that's where that value statement really comes in. And it can get deep, like you said. We start talking about self-determination theory and the autonomy and all the terms. And that's really why I like to simplify it to what's relevant to you right now. Do you like it? Because if you don't, we're in trouble.
Yeah.
And do you feel like you're good at it? And good at it doesn't mean perfection. And that's a really important coaching point for us. It means that you're feeling accomplished with it. When you do it, you do feel that sense of accomplishment, not it's beating you down, right? Because as I mentioned before with my client, I perceived her as being good at it. I perceived her as being successful, but for her, she didn't feel like she was good at the work she was doing. It didn't give her that sense of satisfaction. That's really important. And again, that's maybe one of those really important questions is not that are you satisfied with it, but do you feel like this is serving you and it's working for you?
Yeah, that kind of comfort with asking those questions, I think, comes with time and comes with experience.
Sure.
At the same time, you're never going to get good at it if you don't start to have some of those slightly uncomfortable, deeper conversations. I think back to the 21-year-old version of me, the meathead who, just wanted to be so big he had to turn sideways to walk through doors. Like I don't think I was pushed enough at that point in my career to have those conversations, but I know that you won't start getting good at them until you start to step into that uncomfortable space as a professional.
Yeah. And, I think we all, like, being completely realistic about it as fitness professionals, we need to be prepared for someone to say, well, I'm not a crazy exercise person like you.
Yeah.
And go, I accept that. I'm okay with that. Not be offended by it. Because, for many of us, we're pretty blessed. We're pretty blessed that we found this passion and understanding of it. But we also need to be empathetic at the same time that other people don't see it the same way. And yeah, they might judge us a little bit, which might make this conversation a little hard, but it is our responsibility to say, I understand where you're coming from. There was a point where I struggled with X and this, and not be afraid. It's almost like you take your exercise persona off and just be a human for a day with them, because I do think sometimes people see us as exercise robots or we're this different breed of people, which maybe we are a little bit, let's admit it. But, we come at it different because our motivation, we found something we love and we're passionate about. And it is a blessing, but for others, it's a little hard to relate to us. So we got to, like you said, dive in with those questions and just be prepared. Sometimes what they say back to you might be a little harsh, but it's an opening. They're talking.
Yeah. And sometimes that passion and that excitement kind of blinds us from the empathy that we need to have to really be in that moment with that person. And I know I've been there. Like, what do you mean you're not as excited as I am? So I think that's being aware of that is so important.
It absolutely is. And, it's, it really comes down to, we've got to be better sometimes at listening more than talking. Yeah. And that's really hard. Even just stopping and asking a question and really being uncomfortable in the silence for a second while someone thinks, that's a really good first step. And if you feel like I usually at least count to 5. And I know that's like a really basic tip, but just starting and saying, I'm going to give it, 1,000 all the way to 5. And if you see the person, use that time to look at their body language, look at their face. Do they look uncomfortable? Are they looking down? And that's in those 5 seconds, that gives you an opportunity to notice those things. And it also gives you a moment to think of what the right follow-up question would be to help them. So sometimes those pauses can really, really help you get a sense and look at more rather than think about the next thing you want to say. Or it also gets you to suppress your personal bias and energy and not let it overcome the conversation.
I'm so glad you mentioned silence, and they'll always talk, right? Like if you stay silent for 5 seconds, it's rare it gets to 5 seconds because people don't, it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So they will always talk, but it's such a subtle tool, but like for the most part, it's really never served me wrong. When I used to have a note on my desk, this was after I was a trainer, more an administrator in meetings. It said WAIT, the acronym WAIT. Why am I talking? Right? Because you get so much more out of the conversation when you're listening than you're talking.
I love that. Why am I talking? I love that. And you're right. Usually about 3 seconds in, they will jump. And I've had clients say, well, what do you want me to say? And I go, I don't know. I jump right back at them, and it almost breaks the ice, and we laugh together for a moment. I don't know. I'm not you. I don't, and we just kind of bounce off of each other. And all of a sudden you see this sigh of relief come over them. Like, okay, this is okay. Yeah. She's not going to attack anything that I say. She is joking with me. It's an okay space to be in. So even if they say, or I don't know right now, well, that's fine. Please take some time to reflect. You can reflect now. Or how about the next time you come back, let me know. Or if you want to send me an email or whatever it might be, and realize that sometimes people aren't ready right now. Sometimes they walk in the door because they liked your ad. They don't really know their why. Yeah. And in order, maybe you're asking them something that's a little deep that they're not ready for. It's okay to back off. Again, they're going to give you the signal and tell you if you give them a couple seconds to pause and think.
Yeah. So much rich insight in this conversation. This behavior change fascinates me, so I could talk for hours on end about this, and I'm sure you could too, but we want to be respectful of everyone's time. Certainly your cute puppy in the background is going to want to go outside at some point.
Yeah, he's been pacing a little bit.
So let's start to bring this to a close. And we talked about a lot of things, and there's no way to get experience with coaching behavior change other than to just do it. This is reps, these are skills. But if you were to give our audience maybe one thing or two things that they can emphasize going away from a coaching long-term behavior change, or from a motivation standpoint, what would that be that you'd like them to take away from this conversation?
I'll bring it back to relevance. And we ask a lot when we start to have behavioral conversations with people. We really are. We're asking them, think about their goals. Why are you here? We're asking a lot. It's important that we ask those things. But as a starting point, if you can get down to the nitty gritty of what is really important to you, and that comes down to maybe asking some questions about, life, family, kids, job, if they're waiting to share that information with you. But if you can get them to talk to you about their deep why, their relevant why, what's important to them, I think that gives you a great foundation. So if you're going to work for any one thing in your conversations, I think go for that. And it might be use that word. Some people really understand what relevance is, and other people may look at you and go, I'm not quite with you. What are you talking about? And as an individual, though, I want you to think about that as a coach of your way of getting to that, not just following Renee's way, or Mike's way with this, but really think about how do you get somebody to just dive a little deeper, forget about the outcome or where they see themselves going, and think about right now, I want to move my body because this is important to me, or I want to eat better, or I want to do these stress management techniques because of what? They may tell you something really, it might go back to work or their posture or something really unique that you weren't even thinking about that isn't going to be found in that guidelines book.
Yeah, I love it. Back to relevance. Renee, this has been so great. Where can people go to find out? I mean, it sounds like you're doing all kinds of stuff. I know you and I have seen each other all over the country. It seems like the past, 3 or 4 months. So where can people go to find out about you and all the great work you're doing?
Yeah. So, I've recently left academia. So I'm working now as an independent consultant. I'm consulting on research projects and for a lot of just different corporate corporate entities and industrial spaces developing healthy lifestyle interventions. So I'm using my social media a lot more now, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, just to really update, where I'm at professionally, but also really trying to send messages around the research that's out there and what I'm calling translating it into reality, right? And bridging that gap for fitness professionals. So really trying to post content and think in a way that is digestible, usable, real world information coming out of our research and how to apply it. So I think check me out mostly on social media. I am also the chair of ACSM's Health and Fitness Summit. So we're building new content and really shaking the trees up. So I hope maybe that's a great opportunity for me to get to meet many of you in person. That'd be great.
Awesome. And we will link up to all that. And I was at the Health Fitness Summit this past year. It was great to be back in person with everyone. And so we hope for a larger, more exciting summit next year. But we'll link up to all of those things in the show notes page. And I can attest, I follow Renee on social media. I feel like that's most of the research I get nowadays is from social media, not from journals anymore, because great people like you make it translational to reality. And I don't have to read a method section that I don't understand.
Right. And really thinking about what we can take from it, right? Because a research study is in such a bubble compared to, I know what, all of our fitness pros are doing every day and wellness coaches. It's like we talked about today, it's not so perfect, right? We have to really be creative and unique and relevant with what we do every day.
Yeah. Well, the last question that I want to ask you before we leave is the question I end the podcast with for all of my guests. And, it's my thesis behind this wellness paradox is that there's a gap between fitness professionals and medical professionals. It's a gap in trust and interaction, communication. You started out in medical fitness, which I didn't know. So I'm very curious from your very broad perspective, if you could give one piece of advice as to how a fitness professional can help close that gap off with our medical community, what would that piece of advice be?
Let go of your brand. Your fitness persona needs to really be brought down, and you need to come in as what is best for your patient. I'm here to serve your patient. And I think that's a really hard space. And I found this to be difficult at first when I was in the medical fitness space, because it almost felt like the three of us, the dietitian, the behavioral psychologist, and myself, we were almost competing with time on the medical team.
Yeah.
But when we started to really interact as team members together and have really integrative conversations, all of a sudden our clients took off.
Yeah.
And when we took the I out of the conversation, or my method, my way, this is how I do things. And it really became about, when I work with a patient, the patient tells me X, I respond with Y. Yeah. Those are the kinds of conversations that I really found to be effective with clinicians and build the best work. And I know that I've done a lot of work. I've presented the ADA clinical conference and other spaces like that, where I've heard from clinicians over the years say things like, well, I don't have the trust because I feel like the fitness pro is going to take their bias or their method and lay it on top of my patient. And that's not always right for my patient. Mm-hmm. So I think really starting conversations, when you go in to have those bridging conversations, making sure the I is very far from the discussion. And it's really about we or the patient first.
I love it. What a great perspective. Renee Rogers, thank you so much for joining us on the Wellness Paradox.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Renee as much as I did. If you found it insightful and informative, please share with your friends and colleagues. Those shares make a massive difference for us. Any information we'd like to share with you from today's episode can be found on the show notes page by going to wellnessparadoxpod.com/episode 60. Please be on the lookout for next week's episode when it drops on Wednesday. And don't forget to subscribe through your favorite podcast platform. Until we chat again next week, please be well.